Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the worn leather boots of a medieval castle's night watchman. And trust me, you're about to discover that this job makes modern security work look like a vacation. Picture this. It's the year 1347. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and you're standing at the massive oak gates of Warwick Castle, watching the last merchants hurry through before curfew. The iron portcullis groans as it's lowered with a thunderous clank that echoes through the stone corridors, and suddenly, the weight of protecting an entire fortress and everyone sleeping within its walls rests squarely on your shoulders. You probably think you could handle a night shift in medieval times, but between the complete darkness, the constant threat of raiders, and the fact that your only backup is a horn that half the castle might not even hear, you'd likely be questioning your career choices before midnight. The day guards are already shuffling toward their warm beds, their duties officially over as they hand you the massive iron keys that unlock every door, gate, and storage room in this sprawling stone maze. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how this medieval journey connects us across continents and time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first task as the castle's night watchman is surprisingly mundane yet crucial. You methodically check every latch, bolt, and bar on the main gates. The portcullis might be down, but there are smaller doors, sally ports, and even a few secret passages that need securing. You run your calloused hands along the iron reinforcements, feeling for any looseness that might spell disaster if raiders arrive under cover of darkness. The day shift captain, a grizzled veteran named William, who's been guarding castle since before you were born, walks beside you for this final inspection, his flickering torch casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Remember," William mutters, his breath visible in the cooling evening air, "the Welsh have been restless lately, and Lord Beaumont expects his sleep undisturbed." This is medieval England. At its most paranoid, every castle exists in a state of perpetual low-level anxiety about the next attack, whether from neighboring lords, foreign invaders, or simply desperate bandits looking for an easy score. You nod solemnly, accepting the enormous responsibility that comes with these keys. Historians still argue whether night watchmen were primarily concerned with external threats or internal security. But one thing is certain: you're about to become intimately familiar with both. The castle houses not just the Lord's family, but dozens of servants, guards, craftsmen, and their family, a small town's worth of people whose lives depend on your vigilance. As you complete your inspection of the gates, you notice the peculiar medieval practice of leaving small offerings of bread and ale at the gatehouse shrine, a superstition meant to ensure the castle's protection through the dark hours ahead. The last rays of sunlight disappear completely now, and the real work of your shift begins. You light your own lantern from William's torch, the warm glow creating a small bubble of visibility in the gathering darkness. The castle transforms at night. What seemed familiar and manageable during daylight becomes a maze of shadows, strange sounds, and endless stone corridors that seem to stretch on forever. You adjust your grip on the heavy key ring, feeling the weight of medieval security resting entirely in your weathered hands, and begin your first patrol of what will be a very long night indeed. Your equipment might look simple to modern eyes, but each piece serves a vital purpose in your nightly survival kit. The leather jerkin you're pulling over your woolen tunic isn't just for warmth, it's your armor against both the elements and any trouble that might find you in the dark hours ahead. The leather has been boiled and treated with oak bark until it's tough enough to deflect a knife thrust, though you'd rather not test that theory tonight. The jerkin bears the telltale stains and scratches of countless nights spent patrolling stone walls, and honestly, it smells like a combination of lantern oil, wet wool, and the particular mustiness that comes from spending too much time in underground passages. You strap on your belt, heavy with the tools of your trade, each item carefully chosen through decades of trial and error by watchmen who came before you. The horn hanging at your left hip is carved from a ram's horn and polished smooth by years of handling. When blown with enough force, it can wake the entire castle and summon every able-bodied man to arms. Medieval castles operated on the assumption that any threat requiring the night watch's attention was serious enough to rouse everyone from their sleep. Because frankly, if you're blowing that horn, something has gone terribly wrong. Your lantern is a masterpiece of medieval engineering, though you might not appreciate its sophistication until you're fumbling with flint and steel in a howling wind. The iron frame protects a precious piece of glass, real glass, not the oiled parchment that poorer households make do with, and the candle inside is made from good beeswax, rather than the smoky tallow that servants use. This lantern represents a significant investment by the castle's lord, because a night watchman stumbling around in the dark is about as useful as a chocolate teapot, as they definitely didn't say in medieval times, but absolutely should have. The cudgel tucked into your belt looks deceptively simple, just a piece of seasoned oak about 2 feet long with iron bands reinforcing the striking end. But this weapon has been perfectly balanced for one-handed use while you're holding a lantern, and the leather grip has been worn smooth by countless hands before yours. Medieval night watchmen weren't expected to engage in prolonged sword fights. Your job was to sound the alarm and, if absolutely necessary, buy time for the real soldiers to arrive. The cudgel was designed for quick, decisive strikes that would disable an intruder long enough for you to retreat and call for help. Historians still argue whether night watchmen carried crossbow bolts as standard equipment, but you've got 3 tucked into your belt just in case. The crossbow itself waits in the guardhouse, too cumbersome for regular patrol, but available if the situation escalates beyond what your horn and cudgel can handle. Your boots are perhaps the most important part of your gear. Thick leather soles that won't slip on wet stone, high enough to protect your ankles from the inevitable scrapes and bumps of navigating narrow passages, yet flexible enough to let you move silently when stealth is required. Around your neck hangs a small silver whistle, a backup to your horn that produces a sharper, more piercing note. This whistle can communicate specific messages to other watchmen stationed throughout the castle-owned blast. Means all clear. 2 means investigate. And 3 rapid blasts means arm yourselves and run toward the sound. It's a surprisingly sophisticated communication system for an era when most people couldn't read or write, proving that medieval folks were pretty clever when their lives depended on it. You complete your equipment check by testing the small knife at your belt. Not really a weapon, but essential for cutting rope, trimming candle wicks, and the dozen other small tasks that arise during a 12-hour shift. The blade has been sharpened so many times that it's worn thin, but it still holds an edge well enough for your purposes. As you make final adjustments to your gear, you can hear the castle settling into its nighttime rhythm, the distant sound of servants banking fires, the soft murmur of evening prayers from the chapel, and the reassuring footsteps of your fellow watchmen beginning their own preparations for the long night ahead. The stone steps leading up to the battlements are worn smooth by centuries of guards, making this exact same climb, and you can feel the slight depression in the center of each step where countless feet have tread before yours. Your lantern casts a small pool of wavering light that barely penetrates the darkness ahead, making each step a careful negotiation between your boot and the ancient stone. The narrow spiral staircase forces you to keep one hand on the cold wall for balance, while your other grips the lantern, and you're already developing that peculiar hunched posture that all castle watchmen acquire after years of navigating these cramped passages. As you emerge onto the battlements, the night air hits you with surprising force up here. 30 feet above the courtyard, every breeze becomes a wind that threatens to extinguish your candle. You've learned to cup your free hand around the lantern's glass, creating a small shelter that keeps the flame steady while you make your rounds. The view from up here would be spectacular during daylight, but now it's just an endless expanse of black countryside, punctuated by the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse candle, or the pale ribbon of the river that curves around the castle's eastern wall. Your route along the battlements follows a precise pattern that's been refined over generations. Check each merlon for loose stones that might indicate tampering. Peer through the arrow slits to scan the approaches, and pause at each corner tower to listen for sounds that don't belong in the peaceful night. Medieval castle design assumed that attackers would come under cover of darkness, so every architectural feature, from the height of the walls to the placement of the watchtowers, was calculated to give defenders like you the maximum advantage in spotting trouble before it reached the gates. You pause at the southeastern corner, where the wall offers the best view of the main road leading to the castle. This is where you're most likely to spot the telltale signs of approaching danger. The glint of moonlight on metal, the sound of horses' hooves on the cobblestones, or the suspicious absence of the usual night sounds that might indicate someone is moving stealthily through the darkness. Your eyes have adapted to the dim light now, and you can make out the familiar landmarks: the ancient oak tree that marks the boundary of the Lord's hunting grounds, the stone bridge that crosses the mill stream, and the cluster of peasant cottages that huddle against the castle's outer wall for protection. The most unnerving part of your patrol isn't what you see, but what you hear. Or rather, what you don't hear. A truly quiet night is actually more alarming than one filled with the normal sounds of countryside life. You've learned to distinguish between the rustle of wind in the trees and the sound of someone moving through the undergrowth, between the distant lowing of cattle and the muffled conversation of potential intruders. Tonight, thankfully, you can hear the reassuring hoot of an owl from the direction of the forest, the splash of a fish jumping in the river, and the distant barking of a village doggle, signs that the world beyond the castle walls remains peaceful and undisturbed. Historians still argue whether medieval watchmen were expected to shoot first and ask questions later, but your training emphasizes observation and early warning over direct confrontation. Your job is to be the castle's eyes and ears, not its sword arm. You carry weapons for self-defense, but your primary mission is to spot trouble, while it's still far enough away that the castle's garrison can mount an organized response. This requires a particular kind of patience and attention to detail that not everyone possesses. You need to be alert enough to notice the smallest irregularity, but calm enough not to raise false alarms every time a rabbit rustles in the bushes. As you complete your circuit of the battlements, you make mental notes of everything you've observed. The wind direction, important for determining which approach an enemy might favor, the cloud cover, which affects visibility, and the general feel of the night. Experienced watchmen develop an almost supernatural ability to sense when something is wrong, even when they can't pinpoint exactly what has changed. You've got that feeling tonight. Everything appears normal, but there's a subtle tension in the air that makes you pause and take one more careful look at the countryside before heading back down to continue your rounds in the courtyard below. Time moves differently in the medieval night, and as a watchman, you've become something of an expert in the ancient art of keeping track of hours that seem to stretch like cold honey. Your primary timekeeper is the great bell in the castle's chapel tower, which chimes every hour from sunset to sunrise, assuming Brother Geoffrey hasn't fallen asleep at his post again, which happens more often than the abbot would care to admit. When the bell fails you, and it will, you've learned to read time in the movement of stars across the sky, a skill that would make ancient navigators proud, but mostly just makes your neck ache from constantly looking upward. The constellation you've nicknamed the Watchman's Friend is actually Orion, and you track his slow journey across the heavens like a celestial clock. When his belt appears just above the eastern horizon, you know it's roughly 9 o'clock. When he's directly overhead, midnight has arrived, and when he's sinking toward the western battlements, dawn is only a few hours away. Of course, this stellar timekeeping only works on clear nights, and medieval England seems determined to provide you with an endless succession of cloudy, foggy, or downright miserable weather that obscures your heavenly chronometer. For cloudy nights, you've learned to rely on candle clock specially marked candles that burn at a predictable rate, with notches cut into the wax to indicate the passage of hours. The castle keeps several of these burning in the guardhouse, protected from drafts that would make them burn unevenly and throw off your calculations. Each candle is supposed to burn for exactly 4 hours, though you've noticed they tend to burn faster when it's windy and slower when it's humid, making them about as reliable as a chocolate sword in terms of precise timekeeping. Your internal clock has also adapted to the rhythms of castle life in ways that would seem almost magical to modern people accustomed to digital precision. You know that when the kitchen fires are banked for the night, it's been about 2 hours since sunset. When the last drunken reveler stumbles from the great hall to his sleeping quarters, another hour has passed. When the scullery maids begin their pre-dawn stirring to prepare the ovens for baking bread, you know dawn is less than an hour away, even if you can't see the sky. The most reliable timekeeper, ironically, is your own bladder medieval guards developed an almost supernatural ability to gauge the passage of time by their body's natural rhythms. After years of 12-hour shifts, you've learned that your first urgent need to visit the garderobe occurs roughly 3 hours into your watch, the second around hour 7, and by the time you're desperate enough to consider using one of the corner towers as an emergency facility, dawn is definitely on its way. Historians still argue whether medieval people experience time differently than we do, but as a night watchman, you've certainly developed a more fluid relationship with temporal precision. Minutes don't really matter when your job is measured in the slow progression of hours, and you've learned to think in terms of early night, deep night, and late night rather than specific times. This actually makes you more attuned to the natural rhythms of darkness you can sense when midnight approaches, not by checking a clock, but by the way the very air seems to grow heavier and more still. Water clocks occasionally make an appearance in wealthy castles, though they're more trouble than they're worth in your experience. The water freezes in winter, evaporates too quickly in summer, and requires constant maintenance that, frankly, nobody has time for when there are more pressing concerns like, staying alive through the night. You've seen sand-filled hourglasses, but they need to be flipped regularly, which rather defeats the purpose when you're supposed to be patrolling rather than babysitting timepieces. The strangest aspect of medieval timekeeping is how elastic it becomes during different seasons. Summer nights feel endless when you're sweltering in your leather jerkin, while winter nights seem to race by as you huddle against the cold. Your body learns to compensate for these seasonal variations, developing an internal sense of nighttime that adjusts automatically to the changing length of darkness throughout the year, making you a living, breathing chronometer, perfectly calibrated to the rhythms of medieval life. The castle at midnight is never truly quiet, and you've learned to distinguish between the sounds that belong to a peaceful night and those that might signal trouble brewing in the shadows. Your ears have become finely tuned instruments, capable of picking up the difference between a servant sneaking to the kitchen for a late-night snack and an intruder testing the locks on the treasury door. Tonight, as you make your way through the dimly lit corridors, you're treated to the full symphony of medieval castle acoustics, a mix of the mundane, the mysterious, and the occasionally downright bizarre. The most common sounds are also the most harmless. Rats scurrying through the walls in their eternal quest for crumbs, their tiny claws scratching against stone in a rhythm that's become as familiar as your own heartbeat. Medieval castles are essentially 5-star hotels for rodents, offering an endless buffet of spilled grain, forgotten food scraps, and cozy nesting spots in the thick walls. You've learned to ignore their midnight marathons, unless the scratching suddenly stopsilence from the rats often means something larger and more dangerous has entered their territory. Human snores drift from various chambers, creating a bass note that rumbles through the stone corridors like distant thunder. Lord Beaumont himself produces a particularly impressive nasal symphony that you can hear 3 rooms away, while his wife counters with delicate whistling sounds that somehow manage to be both ladylike and remarkably penetrating. The servants sleeping in the great hall contribute their own varied performance, some whistle, some grunt, some produce sounds that would make a pig jealous. It's actually quite comforting. As long as people are snoring peacefully, You know all is well in their particular corner of the castle. But tonight brings visitors of a different sort. You pause near the kitchen entrance as footsteps echo from the corridor, a head not the confident stride of someone who belongs here, but the hesitant shuffle of someone trying to move quietly and failing miserably. Your hand moves instinctively to your cudgel as you position yourself in the shadows, waiting to see who emerges from the darkness. A moment later, a figure stumbles into the weak pool of light cast by your lantern, and you recognize young Thomas, one of the stable boys, swaying slightly and reeking of ale. "Evening, Thomas," you whisper, causing the boy to jump nearly out of his skin. "Little late for a walk, isn't it?" He mumbles something about visiting the garderobe, but his path was taking him in the direction of the pantries, not the latrines. You've caught him red-handed in what's probably an attempt to raid the kitchen stores, a common enough occurrence that hardly qualifies as a security threat. Still, you escort him back toward the servants' quarters, partly to ensure he doesn't fall down the stairs in his condition, and partly to maintain the fiction that the night watch sees everything. The more unsettling sounds are the ones you can't immediately identify. There's a rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the eastern wing that could be a loose shutter in the wind, or it could be someone trying to signal Confederates outside the walls. Medieval castles are full of hidden passages, priest holes, and forgotten chambers that even the Lord doesn't know about, making it possible for someone to move through the castle without using the main corridors. You investigate every mysterious sound, not because you expect to find spies in every shadow, but because the one time you ignore something unusual might be the time it actually matters. Historians still argue whether medieval castles were genuinely riddled with secret passages, or whether most of these were added by later romantic imaginations. But you've personally discovered 3 hidden doorways during your years of service. One leads to an escape tunnel that emerges near the river, another connects the Lord's chamber directly to the chapel, and the third opens into a storage room that someone clearly wanted to keep very secret indeed. These passages mean that sounds can travel in unexpected ways through the castle, making your job of identifying their sources considerably more challenging. The strangest sound of all is one that shouldn't exist, but persistently does. The soft footsteps that seem to follow you during your rounds, always staying just far enough behind that when you turn to look, nothing's there. Other guards have reported the same phenomenon, and while some blame it on ghosts or castle spirits, you suspect it's actually the echo of your own footsteps being reflected and delayed by the complex acoustics of stone corridors. Still, it's unnerving enough that you've learned to vary your route randomly, just in case those following footsteps belong to something more substantial than echoes and imagination. The Great Hall at night presents a scene that would confuse modern sensibilities. Dozens of people sleeping together in one enormous room, their bodies arranged across the floor like human stepping stones in a sea of straw and rough blankets. As you tiptoe through this medieval dormitory, your lantern casting dancing shadows on the high stone walls, you're witnessing one of the most intimate aspects of castle life, the vulnerable hours when even the mightiest nobles surrender to sleep, snoring and drooling, just like common peasants. The sleeping arrangements follow a strict hierarchy that persists even in unconsciousness. Closest to the great fireplace, where the dying embers still provide precious warmth, sleep the higher-ranking household members, the steward, the marshal, the head cook, and various knights who haven't earned private chambers. They've claimed the best spots on raised platforms or actual beds, though bed in medieval terms often means little more than a wooden frame with rope supports and a straw-filled mattress that's seen better decades. Lesser servants and visiting merchants occupy the middle ground of the hall, their sleeping spots marked by personal belongings, carefully arranged to discourage theft, not that anyone would steal much from people who own so little to begin with. The newest arrivals and lowest-ranking servants sleep closest to the drafty entrance, where your footsteps are most likely to wake them. You've perfected the art of silent walking, placing each foot carefully to avoid the loose floorboards that creak like tortured souls when stepped on incorrectly. The sound that dominates everything is Snoringa Medieval Orchestra, of nasal symphonies that ranges from gentle whistling to sounds that would frighten farm animals. Sir Geoffrey produces a rhythmic rumbling that seems to shake the very walls, while young Lady Margaret manages to snore in a way that's somehow both delicate and surprisingly loud. The servants contribute their own varied performances, creating a background hum that's actually quite soothing once you become accustomed to it. When the snoring stops, that's when you worry either someone has woken up and is watching you, or worse, someone has stopped breathing entirely. Medieval people slept differently than we do, often waking multiple times during the night for prayers, bathroom visits, or simply to stoke the fire. You've learned to recognize the difference between someone stirring naturally in their sleep and someone pretending to sleep while actually observing your movements. The genuinely sleeping shift positions gradually and breathe with consistent rhythm, while those feigning unconsciousness tend to hold themselves too still and breathe too carefully. Tonight, everyone seems genuinely asleep, though you notice old Martha's eyes crack open just enough to track your progress across the room. She's been the castle's head laundress for 30 years and probably knows more secrets than the confessor. The most challenging part of your patrol through the Great Hall isn't avoiding the sleeping bodies. It's dealing with the smell. Medieval hygiene standards would make modern people faint, and when you combine poor personal cleanliness with wool clothing that's rarely washed, straw bedding that harbors every imaginable variety of insect, and the lingering odors from evening meals, the result is an aromatic assault that takes considerable getting used to. You've learned to breathe through your mouth while navigating through the sleeping masses, though this brings its own challenges when you're trying to listen for unusual sounds. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles regularly slept alongside their servants or whether this arrangement was reserved for special occasions, but in your experience, practical concerns override social niceties when it comes to warmth and security. The Great Hall offers the best protection from both cold and potential intruders, making it the logical choice for communal sleeping regardless of social distinctions. Besides, a lord who sleeps apart from his household is a lord who might not wake up when danger arrives. Medieval paranoia has its practical applications. You pause near the dais where Lord Beaumont's chair sits empty, its carved arms gleaming dully in your lantern light. During the day, this chair represents authority and power, but at night, it's just another piece of furniture, no more significant than the rough benches where servants eat their meals. There's something oddly democratic about sleep. It reduces everyone to the same basic human vulnerability, making your job of protecting them feel both more important and more personal than simply guarding property and wealth. The kitchen is the castle's heart, even in the depths of night, and as you push open the heavy wooden door, you're greeted by the familiar sight of glowing embers and the lingering warmth that makes this room the most coveted posting during winter watches. The great hearth dominates the entire spacious stone cavern, large enough to roast an entire ox, though tonight it houses only the carefully banked coals that must never be allowed to die completely. Medieval fire starting is such a laborious process that extinguishing the kitchen fires would be tantamount to a minor catastrophe, requiring precious time and resources to rekindle when the scullery maids arrive before dawn. Your first task is checking that the fire hasn't spread beyond its designated boundaries. Medieval kitchens burn down with alarming regularity, often taking entire sections of castles with them. The stones around the hearth are warm to the touch, but not dangerously hot, and you can see that the cook has properly arranged the logs and ash to maintain a steady burn without flaring into dangerous flames. Banking a fire is an art form that requires understanding exactly how much air to allow, how to arrange the fuel, and how to create the right balance between preservation and safety. Get it wrong, and you'll either wake up to cold ashes or a blazing inferno. The food storage areas require your most careful attention, not because of fire risk, but because they represent the castle's lifeline during sieges or harsh winters. Enormous barrels of salted pork stand like wooden soldiers along the walls, their iron bands gleaming in your lantern light. These barrels are worth more than most peasants earn in a lifetime salt. itself is so valuable that it's sometimes used as currency, and the preserved meat within could mean the difference between survival and starvation if enemies blockade the castle. You run your hands along each barrel, checking for signs of tampering or the telltale dampness that might indicate spoilage. The grain stores occupy an entire alcove, with massive sacks of wheat, barley, and oats stacked nearly to the ceiling. Medieval castles needed to maintain at least a year's supply of grain for their inhabitants, assuming they could keep the rats, weevils, and various other pests from decimating the supplies. You've learned to recognize the sound of grain infested with insecta, subtle rustling that indicates thousands of tiny mandibles at work, slowly converting precious food into worthless chaff. Tonight, thankfully, the grain sacks sound properly quiet, suggesting that the castle's army of barn cats is earning their keep. Hanging from the rafters are sides of bacon, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, and strings of onions that cast bizarre shadows in your flickering light. The bacon is properly smoked and should last through the winter, while the cheese wheels require regular turning to prevent spoilage, a task that falls to the dairymaids during daylight hours. Medieval food preservation relied heavily on salt, smoke, and prayer, making these stores simultaneously precious and precarious. One bout of unusually warm weather or excessive humidity could ruin months of careful preparation. Your lantern illuminates rows of pottery vessels containing honey, the medieval world's primary sweetener, and one of the few foods that truly never spoils. Some of these honey pots are older than you are, their contents still perfectly edible, despite decades of storage. The castle also maintains supplies of dried herbs and spice-precious imports that cost more per pound than silver and are guarded accordingly. A handful of peppercorns represents enough wealth to buy a decent horse, making the spice cabinet one of the most valuable locations in the entire castle. Historians still argue whether medieval kitchens were genuinely as fire-prone as contemporary accounts suggest, but your experience confirms that constant vigilance is essential. The combination of open flames, wooden structures, stored fats, and frequent alcohol consumption creates a perfect storm of combustible conditions. You've personally witnessed 3 kitchen fires during your career, each one spreading with terrifying speed through areas that seemed completely safe just moments before the disaster began. Water storage presents its own challenges. The castle's wells provide fresh water, but maintaining reserves for cooking and firefighting requires careful management of barrels, cisterns, and channels that can freeze in winter or become contaminated by careless handling. You check the water levels and ensure that the covers are properly secured against contamination, knowing that poisoned water supplies have ended more sieges than enemy swords. As you complete your kitchen patrol, the embers pulse with a steady glow that promises warmth and sustenance for another day, assuming you can keep everything safe until dawn arrives. Section 8. The climb to the bell tower tests both your aging knees and your commitment to duty, as the narrow spiral staircase seems to wind upward into infinity. Each stone step worn smooth by centuries of monks, guards, and bell ringers making this same arduous ascent. Your lantern creates a small bubble of light that barely penetrates the darkness above, and you can hear your own breathing echoing off the curved walls as you pause periodically to rest and listen for any sounds that don't belong in this vertical stone tunnel. By the time you reach the bell chamber, your legs are trembling slightly, and you're grateful for the brief respite before tackling your duties in the castle's highest and most exposed position. The bells themselves are magnificent bronze creatures, each one cast with prayers and blessed by bishops, their surfaces decorated with Latin inscriptions that promise divine protection for those who hear their voice. The largest bell, known simply as Great Tom, weighs nearly 2 tons and requires considerable strength to ring properly. You've developed the peculiar muscle development that comes from years of pulling bell ropes, with forearms that would make a blacksmith envious and calloused palms that can grip the roughest hemp without flinching. Medieval bell ringing is both a physical and spiritual discipline, requiring precise timing to mark the canonical hours that structure monastic life. Your primary responsibility up here is marking the passage of time for the entire castle community. Though this seemingly simple task carries enormous weight in an era when most people own no timepieces and depend entirely on your accuracy for their daily routines. The hour bells must ring at precisely the right moments due early, and you'll wake people unnecessarily. Too late, and you'll throw off the carefully orchestrated schedule that governs everything from morning prayers to evening meals. You've developed an internal chronometer that's remarkably accurate, though you still rely on water clocks and marked candles as backup when your natural sense of time feels uncertain. Tonight's bell-ringing routine follows the ancient pattern established by medieval monasteries. 1 toll for 1 o'clock, 2 for 2 o'clock, and so forth, with each sequence repeated 3 times to ensure that even the deepest sleepers receive the message. The sound of Great Tom resonates through the stone walls and carries for miles across the countryside, serving not just the castle, but the surrounding villages whose inhabitants synchronize their lives to your timekeeper. When you pull that rope, you're literally setting the tempo for hundreds of lives scattered across the landscape. The view from the bell tower during daylight would be spectacular, but at night it becomes a strategic vantage point that offers the earliest possible warning of approaching danger. You can see the network of roads that converge on the castle, the river crossings that provide the most likely routes for attackers, and the distant hills where signal fires might appear if neighboring castles spot threats moving through the darkness. Medieval communication relied heavily on visual signals, beacon fires, torch movements, and even the patterns of bell ringing that could convey simple messages across considerable distances. Your eyes sweep the horizon methodically, looking for any unusual lights or movements that might indicate military activity in the area. A fire in the wrong location could signal that raiders are camping nearby, while the absence of expected lights from friendly settlements might suggest that something has happened to their inhabitants. You've memorized the normal nighttime appearance of the landscape, which farmhouses typically show candlelight, where travelers' fires usually appear along the main roads, and how the river looks when moonlight reflects off its surface. Historians still argue whether medieval bell towers were primarily religious or military installations, but your experience confirms that they served both purposes equally well. The same height that allows bells to be heard across great distances also provides unparalleled surveillance capabilities, making the bell tower an essential component of castle defense. The thick stone walls that protect the bells from weather also provide excellent cover for archers during sieges, transforming this peaceful religious space into a deadly military position when circumstances require. The physical demands of tower duty extend beyond climbing stairs and pulling bell ropes. You must also maintain the mechanical systems that keep everything functioning properly. Medieval bells hang from complex arrangements of wooden beams, iron fittings, and hemp ropes that require regular inspection and maintenance. A broken rope or cracked beam could send a 2-ton bell crashing through the tower floor, creating damage that would take months to repair and potentially killing anyone unfortunate enough to be below when disaster strikes. Your maintenance duties keep you busy during quiet moments between the hourly chimes. The first pale hint of dawn, creeping across the eastern horizon, brings both relief and a renewed sense of urgency to your final patrol rounds, as you know that daylight will soon reveal any security lapses or oversights that darkness might have concealed during the long night. Your legs feel heavier now after hours of walking stone corridors and climbing countless stairs, but this is when your vigilance becomes. Most crucial dawn attacks are a favorite tactic of medieval raiders who count on catching their victims in that drowsy period, when night guards might be growing careless and day guards haven't yet assumed their posts. The courtyard takes on an entirely different character in the pre-dawn light, transforming from the mysterious shadowland of midnight into a more familiar workspace, where you can actually see the cobblestones beneath your feet without relying entirely on your lantern. The well in the center of the courtyard, which seemed like a black void during the darkest hours, now reveals its stone rim and the wooden bucket that hangs from the iron chain. You pause here to splash cold water on your face, the shock helping to maintain your alertness during these final crucial hours when fatigue might otherwise dull your senses. Your rounds now include checking that all the night's activities have been properly secured and that the castle is ready for the transition to daytime routines. The stables require attention horses are remarkably good at sensing approaching dawn and often become restless, nickering softly and shifting in their stalls as they anticipate their morning feed. You've learned to read equine behavior as another indicator of the approaching day. When the horses start stirring consistently, you know that sunrise is no more than an hour away, regardless of what the stars or bells might suggest. The castle's gates receive your most thorough inspection during this dawn patrol, as morning is when legitimate travelers, merchants, and messengers are most likely to arrive seeking entry. You check that all the overnight security measures remain in place while preparing for the controlled opening that will allow authorized daylight traffic to resume. The massive iron keys feel familiar in your hands now, worn smooth by years of use, and you can operate each lock by touch alonier skill that proves invaluable when you need to open gates quickly while keeping your eyes focused on potential threats. Kitchen preparations are already beginning as the scullery maids arrive to rekindle the fires that you've carefully maintained throughout the night. The transition from your oversight to their active work requires coordination to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. Fires must be properly stoked without being allowed to flare dangerously. Water supplies need to be checked and replenished, and food stores must be inventoried for any signs of overnight damage or theft. You work alongside the kitchen staff during this handover period, sharing information about anything unusual you've observed during your watch. The Great Hall transforms gradually as its sleeping occupants begin to stir, creating a symphony of yawns, stretches, and the rustling of straw as people rise to face another day. Your presence during this vulnerable transition period helps maintain order, and security people are often disoriented and clumsy immediately after waking, making them more susceptible to accidents or security lapses. You've prevented numerous incidents over the years simply by being present and alert when others were still shaking off the fog of sleep. Historians still argue whether dawn attacks were genuinely more common than raids at other times. But your training emphasizes that this transition period represents a genuine vulnerability that enemies might exploit. The changing of the guard creates opportunities for infiltration, while the general stirring of activity can mask the sounds of approaching threats. Your job during these dawn hours is to maintain the security protocols of night watch while gradually transitioning responsibility to the day shift. The eastern sky continues to brighten, revealing details of the landscape that were invisible during the dark hours. You can now see the roads clearly enough to spot approaching travelers, while they're still far enough away to be evaluated as potential threats or legitimate visitors. The river sparkles in the growing light, and you can make out the individual buildings in the village that huddles against the castle's outer walls. This expanded visibility is both a blessing and a responsibility. With greater sight comes the obligation to use it effectively for the castle's protection. Your body's natural rhythms are fighting against the approaching dawn, as 12 hours of vigilance have left you ready for rest just as the world prepares to wake up. But these final hours demand your complete attention, as the successful completion of your watch depends on maintaining security until your replacement officially takes over and confirms that all is well within the castle walls. Your years of night watch service have taught you that each season brings its own unique challenges and miseries, transforming what might seem like a straightforward security job into a year-round battle against the elements that would make modern outdoor workers reach for their climate-controlled vehicles. Winter nights are perhaps the most brutal, when the stone walls seem to leach warmth from your very bones and your breath creates clouds that obscure your vision just when you need it most. The leather of your jerkin becomes stiff as armor in the cold, making movement awkward and noisy, while your lantern becomes both blessing and curse essential for navigation. But creating such contrast between light and shadow that everything beyond its small circle becomes impenetrably black. Snow presents particular hazards that go beyond simple discomfort, as it muffles sounds that might warn you of approaching danger, while simultaneously making your own movements clearly visible through footprints that announce your patrol routes to anyone watching from the darkness. Ice transforms familiar walkways into treacherous skating rinks, where a single misstep could send you tumbling from the battlements to an unpleasant meeting with the courtyard stones 30 feet below. You've learned to carry a small pouch of ash from the kitchen fires, sprinkling it on icy surfaces to create temporary footing that might mean the difference between completing your rounds and becoming a cautionary tale for future watchmen. Medieval castles weren't designed with winter comfort in mind. They were built for defense, which means lots of arrow slits, murder holes, and other architectural features that invite freezing drafts to whistle through the corridors like malevolent spirits. Your sleeping quarters during winter nights consist of huddling as close as possible to whatever heat source you can find, often meaning you spend break periods pressed against kitchen walls that still retain warmth from the day's cooking fires. The wool clothing that seems adequate during autumn becomes laughably insufficient when real cold arrives, forcing you to layer every garment you own until you resemble a walking pile of fabric more than a human being. Summer brings different but equally challenging conditions, as the same stone walls that drain heat during winter seem determined to absorb and radiate every bit of the day's accumulated sunshine during the hot months. Your leather jerkin becomes a personal torture device that traps heat and moisture against your skin, creating conditions that would violate several modern labor laws, if anyone had invented labor laws yet. The stagnant air in corridors becomes thick enough to practically chew, while the combination of sweat, wool, and medieval hygiene standards creates aromatic conditions that could probably be classified as chemical warfare. Summer storms present their own dangers, as lightning striking the castle's high towers can travel through the stone walls and metal fixtures, creating electrical hazards that medieval people understood instinctively without knowing the science behind them. Rain turns the battlements into rivers and creates flooding in lower areas that can make entire sections of the castle temporarily inaccessible. Your lantern becomes useless in heavy rain, leaving you to navigate by memory and feel through corridors that echo with the sound of water dripping through ancient masonry. Autumn fogs are perhaps the most psychologically challenging weather condition you face, as they reduce visibility to mere feet while deadening sound in ways that make you question whether that footstep you just heard was real or imagined. Medieval people believed that fog harbored evil spirits and supernatural threats, and after enough nights stumbling through pea soup conditions where familiar landmarks disappear completely, you can understand how these superstitions developed. The fog seems to muffle even your own heartbeat while amplifying every creak and rustle into potential signs of danger. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more physically resilient than modern humans, or simply had no choice but to endure conditions that would send contemporary workers home sick. But your experience suggests that adaptation plays a major role in survival. Your body has learned to function effectively despite temperature extremes that would incapacitate someone accustomed to central heating and air conditioning. You've developed calluses in places that don't normally callus, muscles in configurations that don't appear in anatomy textbooks, and a tolerance for discomfort that borders on the supernatural. Spring weather might seem like a relief after the extremes of winter and summer, but it brings its own challenges in the form of unpredictability. You might start your shift in pleasant evening warmth, only to find yourself facing near-freezing temperatures and driving rain by midnight. The rapid weather changes keep you constantly adjusting your gear and strategy, while the muddy conditions created by spring thaws turn every outdoor surface into a slippery hazard that makes quick movement nearly impossible when speed might be essential for responding to threats. The guardhouse becomes your social hub during the long stretches between patrol rounds, a cramped stone chamber that smells permanently of wet wool, stale ale, and the particular mustiness that develops when the same group of men spend too many nights in too small a space. Here, around a small brazier that provides barely enough warmth to keep your hands functional, you gather with your fellow watchmen during brief respites from duty to share stories, complaints, and the occasional swig from whatever drinking vessel someone has managed to smuggle past the sergeant's watchful eye. These moments of camaraderie are what make the job bearable, transforming solitary vigilance into a shared burden that somehow feels lighter when distributed among companions who understand the peculiar challenges of keeping castles safe in the dark. Your fellow guards are a mixed collection of characters who found their way to night watch duty through various circumstances, some voluntary and others decidedly less so. There's old Henrik, a former soldier who claims to have fought in 3 different wars, but whose stories change details each time he tells them, though his practical knowledge of castle defense is undeniably valuable. Young Peter joined the watch to avoid a marriage. His parents arranged to a girl whose dowry included more livestock than he felt comfortable inheriting, while Thomas the Silent earned his nickname, not through any mystical wisdom, but simply because he speaks so rarely that everyone stops talking when he finally opens his mouth. The conversations during these break periods follow predictable patterns that have probably been repeated by night guards since the first castle was built. You discuss the weather, compare notes about suspicious sounds or unusual activities, and engage in the time-honored tradition of complaining about the food, the hours, the pay, and the general unfairness of a world that requires grown men to stumble around dark corridors while more sensible people sleep peacefully in warm beds. These grumbling sessions serve an important psychological function, allowing everyone to voice their frustrations in a safe environment where complaints won't reach the ears of superiors who might respond poorly to criticism. The sharing of ale, when available, follows an informal but strict protocol that reflects the social hierarchies that persist even among men who are essentially equals in their nocturnal duties. Henrik, as the senior guard, gets the first drink and the largest portion, followed by the rest of you in order of seniority and experience. The ale itself is usually weak stuff, barely stronger than water, but it provides psychological warmth and helps create the sense of fellowship that makes long nights more tolerable. Medieval people understood that moderate alcohol consumption could improve morale without significantly impairing performance, though the definition of moderate might surprise modern supervisors. Card games and dice provide entertainment during longer breaks, though gambling is technically forbidden and the stakes are necessarily small given your modest wages. You've become surprisingly skilled at a dice game called Hazard that involves complex betting patterns and enough mathematical calculation to keep your mind sharp during the slow hours. The games serve multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They help pass time, maintain alertness, and create opportunities for the kind of casual conversation that builds trust and cooperation among men, whose lives might depend on each other's reliability. Stories are the primary currency of guardhouse social life, with each man contributing tales from his past, rumors heard from traveling merchants, and increasingly elaborate accounts of supernatural encounters experienced during previous watches. You've heard the same ghost stories dozens of times, but they improve with each telling as details are added and embellished until even the storyteller probably believes the enhanced version. These tales serve practical purposes beyond entertainment, as they often contain genuine warnings about castle hazards disguised as supernatural encounters. That ghostly sound in the East Tower usually indicates loose masonry that needs repair. Historians still argue whether medieval working relationships were more or less egalitarian than modern ones, but the guardhouse operates on principles of mutual dependence that transcend normal social distinctions. A lord's bastard son and a farmer's youngest boy work side by side with equal responsibility and equal risk, creating bonds that might not exist in daylight but prove essential during the dangerous hours when external threats could appear without warning. The practical aspects of guardhouse life require constant negotiation and compromise. Someone must tend the brazier, Someone must maintain the small supply of emergency weapons stored here, and someone must keep track of the duty roster that ensures all critical posts remain covered throughout the night. These mundane responsibilities are shared according to an informal system that has evolved over years of cooperation, with each guard contributing according to his abilities and taking according to his needs, in a miniature communist society that works precisely because everyone understands that their individual survival depends on collective success. When war threatens the surrounding countryside, your nightly duties transform from routine security patrols into a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, where a single missed signal or overlooked detail could determine whether the castle survives until dawn. The very air seems to vibrate with tension during these periods, as every shadow might conceal an enemy scout, and every unusual sound could herald the beginning of a siege that will test everything you've learned about castle defense. Your equipment loadout changes during wartime: additional arrows for the crossbow, a proper sword to supplement your cudgel, and a horn that's been specially tuned to carry farther and cut through the noise of battle should the worst occur. Enemy reconnaissance activities keep you constantly on edge, as skilled scouts probe the castle's defenses during the dark hours, looking for weaknesses that besieging armies can exploit during daylight assaults. These scouts are professionals who move through the countryside like ghosts, capable of approaching within arrow range of the walls without making a sound that untrained ears would notice. You've learned to recognize the subtle signs of their presence, the absolute silence that falls over normal nighttime wildlife. When predators move through their territory, the almost imperceptible displacement of shadows near the tree line, and that peculiar feeling of being watched that raises the hair on your arms even when you can't see anything obviously threatening. Siege preparations require you to monitor not just the immediate castle perimeter, but the entire surrounding landscape for signs of approaching armies or the construction of siege engines that enemy forces might be building under cover of darkness. Medieval warfare often involved weeks or months of preparation before actual combat began, with attacking armies, establishing camps, constructing siege towers, and positioning catapults at carefully calculated distances from their target. Your night vision has become acute enough to spot the glow of enemy campfires from miles away, and you can distinguish between the controlled flames of military cooking fires and the random blazes that might indicate raids on local villages. The castle's defensive preparations create additional responsibilities that fall heavily on the night watch, as siege supplies must be constantly monitored and protected from sabotage attempts that would most likely occur during the dark hours when detection is more difficult. Oil reservoirs for Greek fire, ammunition stockpiles for the ballistas, and food stores that must sustain the castle's population during extended sieges all require your vigilance. You've learned to recognize the signs of tampering with military supplies, subtle changes in the arrangement of barrels, marks indicating that containers have been moved, or the presence of foreign objects that might indicate sabotage attempts. Communication with friendly forces becomes critically important during wartime, as allied armies or relief forces might attempt to coordinate with the castle's defenders through signal systems that operate primarily during nighttime hours. Beacon fires arranged on distant hilltops can convey simple messages about troop movements or battle outcomes, while more sophisticated systems using mirrors or polished metal shields can transmit complex information during periods when moonlight provides adequate illumination. Your position in the bell tower makes you the castle's primary communications officer, responsible for both sending and receiving these vital messages. The psychological pressure of wartime watches affects everyone differently, but you've noticed that extended periods of high alert tend to make guards either hypervigilant to the point of seeing threats everywhere, or dangerously complacent as the constant tension becomes normalized. Maintaining the proper balance between appropriate caution and paralyzing paranoia requires considerable mental discipline, especially during those long nights when enemy activity is suspected but no actual contact occurs. False alarms during wartime can be almost as dangerous as missed genuine threats, as they exhaust defenders and create confusion that enemies might exploit. Historians still argue whether medieval sieges were primarily won through military superiority or through the defender's ability to maintain morale and supplies during extended isolation, but your experience suggests that psychological factors play enormous roles in determining outcomes. A castle that maintains effective night watches can often discourage besieging armies simply by demonstrating that the defenders remain alert and organized, while fortifications that show signs of sloppy security invite increasingly bold, probing attacks that can escalate into full assaults. Sleep deprivation becomes a serious concern during extended military campaigns, as the demands of increased vigilance often require guards to work longer shifts with fewer rest periods between duties. You've learned techniques for maintaining alertness, despite fatigue that would probably interest modern military researchers. Controlled breathing exercises, specific movement patterns that promote blood circulation, and mental exercises that keep your mind engaged even when your body yearns for rest. The stakes during wartime make these techniques essential rather than merely helpful, as falling asleep on watch during peacetime might cost you your job, but doing so during a siege could cost everyone their lives. The hours between your night watch duties reveal a completely different side of medieval castle life, as you transform from the vigilant guardian of darkness into just another member of the complex community that makes the fortress function during daylight hours. Your small living quarters, shared with two other guards, occupies a corner of the castle that receives actual sunlight for a few precious hours each afternoon, a luxury that you've learned to treasure after spending so many nights in artificial lamplight. The narrow window looks out over your personal garden plot, a patch of earth barely 6 feet square where you grow the herbs and vegetables that supplement your official rations and provide the small luxuries that make life bearable. Gardening with medieval tools requires patience that modern people would find almost unimaginable, as you work the soil with implements that haven't changed significantly since Roman times. Your iron spade is a precious possession that you've maintained carefully for over a decade, sharpening the blade regularly and treating the wooden handle with oil to prevent cracking. The small plot yields onions, leeks, and cabbage during good years, along with medicinal herbs like feverfew and chamomile that prove invaluable when the castle's official physician is unavailable, or when you prefer not to admit to minor ailments that might affect your fitness for duty. Equipment maintenance occupies much of your daylight time, as the constant use and harsh conditions of night watch duty take a heavy toll on gear that must function reliably when your life depends on it. Your leather jerkin requires regular treatment with oils and waxes to maintain flexibility and water resistance, while the metal fittings need constant attention to prevent rust that could cause critical failures at the worst possible moments. The horn and whistle must be checked for cracks that might affect their sound, and your lantern requires cleaning and adjustment to ensure it provides adequate light without consuming excessive amounts of precious candle wax. Your family responsibilities compete with rest and equipment maintenance for the limited daylight hours available between shifts. Your wife manages the household with remarkable efficiency, though the irregular schedule of night work creates challenges that affect everything from meal planning to childcare. Your two young sons see you primarily during the afternoon hours when you're often fighting fatigue, creating a family dynamic that's quite different from that of craftsmen or farmers whose work follows more predictable patterns. Teaching them practical skills like reading, basic weapon handling, and the fundamentals of castle life must be fitted into whatever time remains after your other obligations. The castle's daytime economy provides opportunities for additional income that help supplement your official wages, which are adequate for survival but insufficient for the small luxuries that make medieval life more pleasant. You've developed expertise in leather working, using techniques learned from maintaining your own gear to repair equipment for other castle residents who lack the time or knowledge to handle their own maintenance. This side business provides enough extra income to afford better food, occasional new clothing, and small gifts for your family that help compensate for the sacrifices they make to accommodate your unusual work schedule. Sleep during daylight hours presents unique challenges that modern shift workers would recognize, though medieval solutions are necessarily more primitive than contemporary approaches. Your sleeping chamber can be darkened somewhat by hanging heavy cloth over the window, but complete darkness is impossible when the rest of the castle is engaged in the full activity of daytime life. The sounds of daily castle operations, hammering from the blacksmith, conversations in the courtyard, and the general bustle of a community going about its business create a constant background noise that makes deep sleep difficult to achieve and maintain. Historians still argue whether medieval working families experienced more or less stress than their modern counterparts, but your experience suggests that the challenges are different rather than necessarily greater or lesser. The security that comes from living within a protective community and having clearly defined roles balances against the physical demands of manual labor and the constant awareness that external threats could disrupt your carefully organized life with little warning. Your children will likely follow similar paths, as social mobility in medieval society is limited, but the skills required for castle service provide relatively stable employment for those willing to master them. Social interactions during daylight hours follow patterns that reflect both your status as a trusted castle employee and your role as a member of the broader community that includes craftsmen, servants, and their families. Your knowledge of the castle's nighttime secrets makes you a valuable source of information and gossip, while your training in weapons and security provides expertise that neighbors occasionally need for their own purposes. These relationships create a social network that extends far beyond your immediate job responsibilities, providing the kind of community support that helps medieval people cope with the uncertainties and hardships of their era. After 4 decades of nocturnal vigilance, your weathered hands shake slightly as you guide young Edmund through his first night watch training, passing on the accumulated wisdom of countless dark hours to a boy who still believes that courage and enthusiasm can substitute for the patient expertise that only comes from years of stumbling through stone corridors with nothing but a flickering lantern for company. The irony isn't lost on you that teaching someone to do your job properly requires demonstrating all the ways it can go wrong, sharing the hard-earned knowledge that has kept you alive through wars, sieges, harsh winters, and the 1,000 small emergencies that punctuate a night watchman's career like unwelcome surprises in an otherwise predictable routine. Edmund reminds you painfully of yourself at 17, eager to prove his worth, convinced that physical strength and good intentions will overcome any obstacle, and completely unprepared for the psychological toll of spending half his life in darkness while the rest of the world sleeps peacefully. You remember that same confidence, the belief that night watch would be an adventure rather than a grinding test of endurance that would slowly wear away pieces of your soul like water eroding stone. The boy's enthusiasm is both touching and exhausting, as he asks endless questions about techniques that have become so automatic you've forgotten they needed to be learned. Training a successor involves more than simply explaining procedures. You must somehow convey the subtle instincts that separate competent guards from those who don't survive their first serious emergency. How do you teach someone to distinguish between the sound of wind in the corridors and the whisper of an intruder's clothing? How do you explain the feeling that warns you when something is wrong, even when everything appears normal? These skills develop through experience that can't be rushed, making your teaching role both crucial and fundamentally limited. You can show Edmund where to look and what to listen for, but the ability to actually see and hear danger must develop through his own encounters with the night. Your own training, 40 years ago, seems almost mythical now, conducted by grizzled veterans who spoke little but demonstrated everything with the patience of men who understood that their own lives might someday depend on their students' competence. Master Robert, your first instructor, died during the siege of 1315, and you realize with uncomfortable clarity that Edmund will probably outlive you, just as you outlived the men who taught you the fundamentals of castle defense. This generational transition is both natural and melancholy, as each new guard represents the continuation of traditions that stretch back centuries, while simultaneously marking the passage of time that brings you closer to retirement or death. The castle's night watch traditions include rituals and superstitions that seem foolish to outsiders but serve important psychological functions for men who spend their careers confronting darkness and uncertainty. You teach Edmund the proper way to light his lantern, not just for practical illumination but as a ceremony that marks the transition from daylight citizen to nighttime guardian. The small prayers whispered before each shift, the specific route for the first patrol, and the traditional inspection of equipment aren't just procedures. They're psychological anchors that provide stability and confidence when facing the unknown challenges that each night might bring. Edmund's questions about retirement reveal his assumption that guards simply work until they're physically unable to continue, then fade away into obscurity like worn-out tools that have served their purpose. You explain the reality of medieval employment security, that loyal service does provide some protection against destitution in old age, but that guards who survive long enough to retire must plan carefully for a future that offers limited options and no guarantees. Some former watchmen become gatekeepers or maintenance supervisors, while others retreat to small cottages where they tend gardens and share stories with younger guards who seek their advice. Historians still argue whether medieval workers experienced anything resembling modern career satisfaction, but your own relationship with night watch duty is complex enough to confuse contemporary analysts. The work has been simultaneously fulfilling and exhausting, providing purpose and identity while extracting a physical and emotional toll that's difficult to quantify. You've protected hundreds of people over the years, prevented numerous disasters, and maintained traditions that connect you to generations of guards who face similar challenges with similar dedication. Yet you've also sacrificed normal sleep patterns, family time, and the simple pleasures that daylight workers take for granted. The knowledge you're passing to Edmund represents more than job training. It's a form of immortality that allows your experience and expertise to continue protecting the castle long after your own night watch career ends. Every technique you demonstrate, every warning you share, and every story you tell becomes part of the collective wisdom that future guards will draw upon when facing their own dark nights. In this way, your 40 years of service extend far beyond your individual career, contributing to the unbroken chain of vigilance that has kept this castle secure through wars, plagues, political upheavals, and the countless smaller threats that emerge from the darkness to test the resolve of those brave enough to stand watch while others sleep. Your final night of active watch duty carries a weight that goes beyond simple nostalgia as you walk the familiar stone corridors one last time with the knowledge that tomorrow these responsibilities will belong entirely to younger hands and that your 4 decades of nocturnal service are drawing to their inevitable close. The castle feels different, somehow not physically changed, but emotionally transformed by your awareness that you're experiencing these sights, sounds, and sensations for the last time as an active guardian rather than as a retired observer. Each stone step, each flickering shadow, each distant sound takes on a significance that makes your final patrol feel more like a pilgrimage through the accumulated memories of a lifetime spent in darkness. The equipment that has served you faithfully through countless nights feels heavier in your weathered hands, though you know the weight hasn't actually changed its. Your perception that has shifted as you prepare to pass these tools to Edmund and the other young guards who will carry on the traditions you've helped maintain. Your lantern, with its familiar scratches and dents that mark specific incidents from past years, casts the same warm glow it always has, but tonight, that light seems to illuminate not just the corridor ahead, but the entire journey that brought you to this moment of transition, from active service to honored retirement. The castle's nighttime sounds create a symphony that you've heard thousands of times before, yet tonight you find yourself listening with the heightened attention of someone trying to memorize a melody that won't be part of your daily experience much longer. The distant snoring from the great hall, the soft footsteps of your fellow guards making their own rounds, the gentle creaking of wooden beams settling in the cooling night air, all these familiar sounds take on the quality of old friends you're preparing to leave behind. Your ears have become so attuned to the castle's nocturnal rhythms that you can identify individual snorers and predict exactly when each hour's patrol will bring you within earshot of specific sounds. The battlements offer their usual commanding view of the countryside, but tonight the familiar landscape seems to be bidding you farewell as you scan the horizon one final time for threats that, mercifully, fail to materialize during your last official watch. The stars that have guided your timekeeping for 4 decades shine with the same steady light they always have, yet somehow they seem to be acknowledging your long service with their gentle radiance. You've learned to read the night sky like a book, using celestial movements to mark the passage of hours and seasons, and tonight those stellar companions seem to be offering their benediction on a career well served. Your thoughts drift to the countless nights that brought you to this moment, the terrifying siege of 1315, when enemy forces surrounded the castle for 3 months, the bitter winter of 1329, when you nearly froze to death during an ice storm that knocked out half the castle's heating, the night in 1334, when you single-handedly prevented a fire that could have destroyed the entire East Wing. Each memory represents not just a personal experience, but a contribution to the castle's ongoing story, a thread in the tapestry of security that has kept this community safe through decades of uncertainty and change. The young guards who will inherit your responsibilities move through the castle with energy and enthusiasm that remind you of your own early years, though their eagerness is tempered by the knowledge you've tried to share about the patience and vigilance that true night watch service requires. Edmund shows particular promise, demonstrating the kind of instinctive awareness that can't be taught but must develop naturally in those suited for this demanding work. Watching him conduct his rounds with growing confidence provides reassurance that the castle's nocturnal security will remain in capable hands even after your retirement. As dawn approaches and your final shift nears its end, you find yourself walking more slowly than usual, reluctant to complete the rounds that will officially conclude your active career as a night watchman. The familiar weight of keys at your belt feels both lighter and heavier than usual, lighter because you know you'll soon be free of their constant responsibility, heavier because they represent the authority and trust that have defined your adult life. Tomorrow, these keys will hang from Edmund's belt, and your hands will feel strangely empty without their familiar burden. Historians still argue whether medieval workers experienced anything resembling modern concepts of career fulfillment. But as you prepare to complete your final patrol, you feel a deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've served faithfully and well. The castle stands secure. Your knowledge has been passed to capable successors, and your 4 decades of vigilance have contributed to the safety and continuity of a community that will remember your service long after your name is forgotten. In a world where most people's lives leave little lasting impact, you've helped maintain traditions and protections that will endure for generations. The eastern sky begins to show the first pale hints of dawn as you make your way toward the guardhouse, where Edmund waits to officially assume the responsibilities you're laying down. Your step is steady despite your advanced years. Your eyes remain sharp despite decades of straining to see through darkness, and your commitment to the castle's security burns as strongly as ever, despite the weariness that comes with age. As you prepare to hang up your lantern for the final time, you know that you're not just ending a career, you're completing a chapter in the castle's long story of survival, security, and the quiet heroism of those who stand, watch while others sleep. The soft light of dawn creeps across the stone walls as you settle into the guardhouse chair that will soon belong to someone else, your final night of active duty drawing to its peaceful close. Your breathing slows as the tension of responsibility gradually lifts from your shoulders, replaced by the gentle exhaustion that comes with work well done and duties faithfully completed. The sounds of the waking castle drift through the window, servants beginning their morning routines, animals stirring in the stables, the distant bell that marks the canonical hours continuing its ancient rhythm of marking time's passage. You can feel sleep approaching like an old friend, the natural tiredness that follows a night of vigilance made sweeter by the knowledge that this rest is truly earned and well-deserved. Your eyes grow heavy as you listen to Edmund beginning his own patrol, his footsteps echoing through corridors that you know by heart but will no longer walk as their guardian. The familiar sounds of the castle's morning awakening blend into a gentle symphony that carries you toward the peaceful sleep you've earned through 40 years of faithful service. As consciousness fades and sleep finally claims you, your last waking thought is of gratitude for the opportunity to serve, for the community you've helped protect, for the traditions you've helped preserve, and for the simple privilege of completing a difficult job with honor and dedication. The castle is safe, the watch continues, and you can rest at last with the deep satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to something greater than yourself. The morning sun streams through the guardhouse window, warming your weathered face as you drift into the kind of profound, restful sleep that can only come to those who have truly earned their rest through years of standing guard, while others slept peacefully, protected by your vigilance through the long, dark hours of countless nights. The morning light grows stronger as your breathing deepens into the rhythm of well-earned rest. 40 years of nocturnal vigilance settle into memory as the castle awakens around you, secure in the knowledge that the ancient traditions of protection continue. The stone walls that have sheltered so many now shelter you in return, offering the peace that comes only to those who have faithfully kept the watch through darkness, waiting for dawn.